LiberalViewer presents.
So, welcome to the March 14th edition of LiberalViewer Monday Media Mixup. Thanks for joining me. Happy Pi Day to the math nerds that celebrate out there, I guess. I'll be using the 13 best, most newsworthy clips from the Sunday morning news analysis shows from the big five corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News, so-called corporate media here in the United States, for which would be an entertaining, informative media criticism and political commentary show for you all today. You can see from the title of my video, the main topic is stopping Russian invasion of Ukraine without starting World War III, which is the main topic of most of my newsmaker clips, although I have some stuff on inflation and gas prices at the end. And I will show you all the news summaries from all five of the big five corporate outlets where they have their anchor and their reporter in Kyiv talking. But I want to start the show with political comedy. This is, I guess there's a long tradition of American comedians making fun of our purported enemies. Russia and Vladimir Putin are apparently we're not actually at war, but we're on the side of Ukraine here. And so Saturday Night Live started off the Weekend Update segment with multiple jokes at the expense of Russia and Vladimir Putin. And I'll show you a few of those. And as usual, you can watch the entire segment, in fact, the entire Saturday Night Live episode at links I put down in the video description under sources. First I have the media mentioned with brief summaries of what is in each of the 13 clips, then the sources of all my clips. And so you can watch all of Saturday Night Live, all of the Weekend Update segment, but here's the beginning of it that I wanted to show you and talk about with you a little more after we watch it together over here.
This week marks 2 years since the beginning of the first COVID lockdown, and let's just say some people have handled the stress better than others. Russia has passed a fake news law that makes it illegal for any organization to report information that contradicts what the government says, which explains the recent headline, 6'5" Putin not insane. President Biden downplayed the possibility of U.S. military intervention, saying, "We will not fight the Third World War in Ukraine." And I understand, but it's hard to stand by and watch Putin bombing things like schools, a maternity ward, and I'm just going to assume puppy daycare centers. The situation is so upsetting that I've honestly thought about marching down to the nearest Army enlistment office and signing Che up.
And you see, then they go on to talk about high gas prices and inflation, which is why I'm doing it. Well, that's not why, but because it's a big topic. And it's going to be a bigger and bigger topic as we get closer to the November midterms, because the Republicans are going to make that one of their main lines of attack on the Biden administration and on Democrats. That's also an important topic, and that's why I have a couple clips on at the end talking about how actually it's not really the Biden administration's fault, inflation, high gas prices, but I'll get to that at the end. I also, I was talking about last week how when things make it into the Saturday Night Live skits, it shows you how, certain news facts have filtered through to the low information voters, and whether or not Putin is a rational actor, he's 6'5" and completely sane or whatever, and how he hasn't done well with the isolation from COVID. Those are things that are worrying a lot of people and has filtered into the cultural zeitgeist by being mentioned on Saturday Night Live's Weekend Update, not just a news show, but the political comedy. So, and you also saw the mention of World War III. Lots of mentions of World War III. People are getting more and more anxious about that. So I'm going to cover that in the newsmaker clips especially, but it's also covered, different ways that the Russian invasion of Ukraine could escalate. And one of those things happened, it was a big news story over the weekend that Russia hit this training center, this military training center about 12 miles from the Polish border, all the way in the west of Ukraine. You'll see that reported in most of these news summaries. I'm going to go from the longest to the shortest. ABC had the longest news summary. Martha Raddatz and Pannell, I think, covered most of the important issues, but I'll talk about their coverage and how it juxtaposes to the other coverage after, well, first we'll start with ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, with permanent guest host, or whatever her title is, Martha Raddatz, over in this clip.
And welcome to This Week. We are back in Lviv, Ukraine this morning, to a city transformed. 3 weeks ago, when we broadcast from here, we were on the verge of war, yet life seemed normal as residents freely roamed the streets. But now, as soldiers, checkpoints, and tank traps line the streets, the sense of security over Western Ukraine is gone. Overnight, less than an hour west of here, Russian warplanes struck a military facility which the United States and NATO forces had used to train Ukrainian troops. The attack, about 10 miles from the Polish border, has left at least 35 dead, 134 wounded, and marks a dramatic escalation of hostilities just a day after a top Russian official warned arms shipments to Ukraine were legitimate targets. And just before we came on the air raid sirens went off in this city for the first time in daylight. We visited another base here in the West where some of the thousands of foreign fighters, including Americans, have dropped everything and come to face off with the Russians. We'll hear their stories in just a moment, but we begin with the very latest on Russia's widening assault across Ukraine, including fierce fighting outside the capital city, Kyiv. That's where our senior foreign correspondent, Ian Pannell, is located. Good morning, Ian.
Yeah, good morning, Martha. I think two major developments over the weekend. First, Russian troops finally pushing into the besieged city of Mariupol down on the Black Sea coast. Their video recorded by the Associated Press clearly showing Russian tanks targeting residential buildings. And as you know, deliberate targeting of civilians is considered a war crime. And that other significant development, as you say, the targeting of this former training base that was used by NATO to train the Ukrainian forces. There were no NATO troops there at the time, but that clearly seems to be designed to send a message to America and the West.
Week 3 of Russia's invasion of Ukraine has seen a violent widening of the Kremlin's offensive, using indiscriminate large-scale aerial bombardment to try to achieve what Putin's sluggish land forces are failing to do, force towns and cities to capitulate. The hardest hit has been the Black Sea port of Mariupol. After days of shelling and failed ceasefires, the Russians launched an horrific attack on a children's and maternity hospital. The entire population there has been under siege for over a week, without power, heating, and short of water and food. This was a week when mass graves were dug in Ukraine for the growing ranks of the dead. A growing surge of people are using temporary local ceasefires to escape.
Well, that is what a Russian ceasefire sounds like. We're on the outskirts of the town of Irpin. We've been hearing the sound of bombardment over the last hour as civilians try to get out.
The lulls in the fighting allowed people to flee towns. Shell-shocked and cold, we met Nadia and Petro, husband and wife, who just escaped Bucha. The Russians destroyed everything in our house. They forced my husband onto his knees and beat him up, Nina says. The Russians then looted their house. In verified video released by the Ukrainian Ministry of Defense, a massive column of Russian tanks and armored vehicles was ambushed as they drove towards the northeast outskirts of Kyiv. Renewed efforts at diplomacy appeared to fail again this week, with Russia insisting Ukraine change its constitution to say it'll never join NATO or the EU, recognise Crimea as Russian and the eastern separatist regions as independent. Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov even claiming Russia never attacked Ukraine. But this war has entered a dangerous moment. There are growing concerns about the lack of an off-ramp to end this conflict.
I think Putin is angry and frustrated right now. He's likely to double down and try to grind down the Ukrainian military with no regard for civilian casualties. He has no sustainable political endgame.
The consequences of that started to play out this week. Russia making false claims Ukraine's preparing to use chemical weapons. The fear is that this propaganda push could precede a real attack by Russia using chemical weapons. President Biden increasing the economic retaliation this week by banning Russian energy imports.
Russian oil will no longer be acceptable at U.S. ports, and the American people will deal another powerful blow to Putin's war machine.
And now major US brands punishing Russia by pulling out. McDonald's symbolized the end of Russia's Soviet era. This week, it temporarily closed all of its stores. Putin dismissing these sanctions, but the economic impact of this disastrous war is being felt in Russia. As Putin's war closes in, the strong words and sanctions may be appreciated, but for millions of Ukrainians, it's too little and too late.
Well, the mayor of Lviv speaking about that attack on the peacekeeping base, as they describe it, a military base that was targeted by 30 missiles fired by Russia, warning Joe Biden, warning NATO that Russia is encroaching ever closer to NATO territory, saying, do you realize that Russia is on your border? Of course, we know that the Ukrainian authorities have been trying to encourage more military support. They want, of course, this no-fly zone, which has been ruled out by the Biden administration. But I think as it gets closer, these missiles that were fired so close to the Polish border, I think that's really going to raise concerns in the coming days of the risks of this war widening. Martha?
Thanks so much, Ian. Ian Pannell in Kyiv for us this morning. The governor of Lviv was called away for an emergency meeting, but we are joined now by the deputy mayor of Lviv, Andrew Moskalenko.
So you can see there that the ABC News summary, which was the longest, and I don't know, I mean, maybe the best. You can tell me what you think when I juxtapose it with the next ones, that they had their reporter in Kyiv, Ian Pannell, and then they went to, well, it was supposed to be the mayor, and then they got the vice mayor, but because of changing events, but that was all the news summaries that I'm about to show you start with the anchor and then a reporter in Kyiv, and then they all make like different decisions as to where to go next, which we can compare and decide which we think is best. And I mean, I don't necessarily disagree with the point of view that you saw expressed in that narration, but it was definitely like a pro-American point of view. That I think they called it Putin's war, and they talked about how, you know, Russia's like telling lies to get ready to tell more lies, or the whole thing about the false flag and the chemical weapons. And that was definitely, I mean, all the American corporate media you're going to see are going to give you a narrative that is very pro-American, but I mean, that's the way it's always been as long as I've been watching. And, you know, when I first saw that, like, bombing of the maternity hospital, I was a little skeptical because I'm old enough to remember when Iraq took over Kuwait, there were these stories about babies ripped out of incubators that turned out not really to be true, but because that's the kind of thing that you see in war. I was talking about this last week about how the first casualty of war is the truth or whatever, and even like the most journalistic organizations seem to like feel some sort of responsibility to support our side or whatever, and you can see that in each of these news summaries. I think you know, there was Putin's war. I think on NBC News Meet the Press they kept calling it Russia's war of choice, and I think you're going to see that in the next news summary. And by the way, I said I was skeptical of that maternity hospital story, but as far as I can tell, it's totally true. Russia did bomb a maternity hospital. They kind of admitted it, although they said there was something else in that hospital that they were trying to bomb or whatever. But so it's not like one of those things like the babies ripped from incubators in Kuwait, I guess. But you just have to keep an eye on that, and let's keep an eye on it as we compare ABC with, you know, there's no pre-recorded package here. It's just Chuck Todd talking, and then going over to their reporter, Richard Engel, also in Kyiv, like Ian Pannell. And let's compare the reports and talk about them both a little more after we watch the NBC News Meet the Press news summary from yesterday together over here.
Good Sunday morning. I hope you can get that extra hour of sleep at some point today. As Russia's hopes of a lightning-quick victory have evaporated, it's shifted instead to shooting at people who can't shoot back. Consider these lasting images of Russia's war of choice here. A mother, her 2 children, a family friend lying dead in the street, struck down as they simply ran for safety. And then there's this, babies and pregnant women being evacuated from a maternity hospital after it was targeted by Russia. Russia continued its onslaught, closing in on Kyiv and now hitting western cities, including an attack overnight at a military training center near Lviv that was just 15 miles from the border with Poland, a NATO ally. Ukrainian forces are hitting back, attacking that convoy outside of the capital. But in the besieged city of Mariupol, where mass graves are being dug, there's no food, no water, and no way out right now. And there are increasing concerns that Russia may use chemical or biological weapons as a way to try to target insurgents hiding in basements, even as it accuses Ukraine of planning such an attack. But as Volodymyr Zelensky said, if you want to know Russia's plans, look at what Russia accuses others of. So is Vladimir Putin really looking for an off-ramp? If so, what kind of deal can you make to end a war with a country that won't even admit there is a war? In a moment, I'm going to bring you my interview with the National Security Advisor to President Biden, Jake Sullivan. But we're going to begin with our chief foreign correspondent, Richard Engel, who's in Kyiv. And Richard, President Zelensky yesterday described Russia's assault now as a new stage of terror. What is he saying?
Well, it feels like we are at a new phase of this war, that initially the attacks by Russia were in the east and in the south. There was some speculation that Russia might try and do a lightning campaign and then sue for some sort of peace deal. The negotiations, however, have gone nowhere, and now Russia's adopting much more long war tactics, besieging towns and cities in the south and in other places, and then carrying out these attacks in the west overnight and also yesterday. The west of this country is still open. It is still open to Eastern Europe, and that has been an active supply line, bringing in weapons from Eastern Europe into this country, particularly American weapons, those javelins that have been so effective against Russian armored vehicles. And now with this strike overnight on that training base that killed at least 35 people, according to the local governor, and injured more than 100. It seems that Russia is saying that nothing is off limits, and it is trying to limit those supply of shoulder-fired Stingers, javelins, and other kinds of weapons that have been flowing into this country. Also, watch what's going on in the south, another indication that Russia's going for a long war. The Russians are now trying to set up their occupation in a more permanent way, even though there have been protests against the Russian presence in the city of Melitopol, which Russia controls. Russian forces replaced the mayor and appointed a Russian agent, and local officials worry that Russia is going to hold some sham referendum to make its political occupation more permanent.
Hey, Richard, I'm concerned about the strike in the West. I know you had an interview over the weekend with a U.S. military veteran, not active duty. We don't have any active duty U.S. military in the country. But he's of Ukrainian descent. He's an American citizen, and he was training for the fight to help Ukrainians against the Russians. We could have a number of American citizens in country fighting the Russians right now. Perhaps they were targeted in that strike, correct?
It's possible, and I've met several Ukrainian Americans who are here, who volunteered, who are heading toward the front lines or are here in this city. So as this war continues and continues to escalate, it is very possible you're going to have dual nationals, Americans. There was some sort of explosion, and again, it sounds like it was pretty far away, but on the close to Kyiv just now. So yes, it is possible that you could have foreign nationals, including Americans, caught up in the violence.
Well, Richard Engel.
Likely, I would say.
Richard Engel with the reminder in the background there that this is an active war zone. Richard, thank you. And joining me now is President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan. Jake, welcome back to Meet the Press.
And I will have a clip of the Jake Sullivan interview that Chuck Todd did on Meet the Press. And you see Chuck Todd decided to do the back and forth with Richard Engel and then go straight to a newsmaker interview. Also a good journalistic choice. In fact, I mean, they all make good journalistic choices this week. I've been criticizing Fox News last week and 3 weeks ago for how they decided to go to the political reporting, like the reporter in Delaware first, rather than the reporter in Kyiv. Though there's a strange story about Benjamin Hall, the reporter in Kyiv from Fox News on Fox News Sunday that is the news summary after CNN. But before I get to that, the Meet the Press news summary, one thing I noticed, having watched all the clips 3 times, as I do. You know, I watch the news show first, then I watch the clip when I capture it, then I watch it a 3rd time with all of you. And I think Richard Engel was the only one really to report on the preparations for a longer occupation in the south there, the possibility of the sham referendum, the setting up the Russian agent instead of the mayor and all that stuff. So I guess in that sense, the NBC report gave some more details than you saw in the ABC one, although there was a lot of crossover in the facts there. CNN State of the Union, Dana Bash was the host this week, and they've been doing this thing since the invasion of Ukraine where, they do State of the Union 6 a.m. Pacific time, my time, and then 9 a.m. Pacific time. And usually the 3-hour later show is just a recording of the 6 a.m. show. But for the last few weeks, they haven't been doing that. They've been doing a whole new show. That means I have to watch an extra hour of TV to put this show together for you all. And so I watched both hours, and for some reason they don't tell you the State of the Union at the beginning of the second hour, but they have the more up-to-date news summary. So I'm going to show you the State of the Union. That's something Jake Tapper started when he took over the show. Every week he tells you what is the State of the Union this week. Dana Bash did it at 6 a.m., not at 9 a.m. So I'll show you the first 30 seconds from 6 a.m., then the rest of it from 9 a.m. Here's the 6 a.m. beginning of CNN State of the Union yesterday that we can talk about after we watch it together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, where the State of our Union is reeling from what we are seeing in Ukraine. And there is a lot of breaking news this morning. Russia is pounding western Ukraine, firing more than 30 missiles at the International Peacekeeping and Security Center, a military base that includes a training center. At least 35 people are dead and 134 are injured, according to the head of the Lviv Regional Military Administration. Take a look.
So that was the beginning at 6 a.m. At 9 a.m., by the time they got to 9 a.m., there was breaking news about a journalist having been killed. And as I mentioned many, many times, that's a bias all of the media has. If journalists are threatened, hurt, or especially killed, that is the top story. And it was the top story when Dana Bash came back 3 hours later for the full news summary that I'll talk about with you a little more after we watch together over here.
Hello, I'm Dana Bash in Washington, and welcome to a special live edition of State of the Union. We are following breaking news. A U.S. journalist, Brent Pannell, was killed by Russian forces in Ukraine, and another journalist was injured as Russian President Vladimir Putin escalates his attacks. Today, targeting western Ukraine, firing more than 30 missiles at a military base near Lviv. At least 35 people are dead and 134 are injured, according to the head of the Lviv Regional Military Administration. Take a look at this location. The base is only about 11 miles from Poland, a NATO nation. The attack comes as Russian forces continue to bombard Ukrainian cities and are now 15 miles outside the capital, Kyiv. Down south in Mariupol, city officials say nearly 2,200 residents have been killed. France's president is warning after a phone call with Vladimir Putin that the Russian leader seems determined to continue the war. I want to go straight to Ukraine and CNN chief international correspondent Clarissa Ward, who is live in Kyiv. Clarissa, what is the latest on the ground there?
Well, Dana, according to the Pentagon, this strike on the Yavoriv International Training Center in western Ukraine is the third strike on western Ukraine or in western Ukraine in the last 2 days. It's important to keep in mind that initially the anticipation had been that Russia would not try to target western Ukraine because of its proximity to Poland and other European countries. But that's clearly not the case. CNN spoke to an eyewitness who said that shortly after 5 o'clock this morning, there was a massive clap and then a series of missile strikes on this base, 3 that he could know for certain. 35 people killed, as you mentioned, more than 130 injured. It's not known whether some of them may be foreign nationals as well as Ukrainians, because from our understanding, this base was essentially being used as a receiving center, Dana, for the so-called Foreign Legion, or international fighters from all around the world who have been pouring into Ukraine to fight against the Russian invasion alongside Ukrainian forces. Meanwhile, you mentioned the death of that U.S. journalist that took place in Irpin, which is a northwestern suburb of Kyiv. It's a place where my colleagues and I and many of us have spent a lot of time over the last week. There was another U.S. journalist who was also with him who was also shot, but is now injured and being treated in the hospital. And the mayor of Irpin has come out and basically said that no journalists will be allowed into this suburb anymore because the situation is so dangerous, because the situation is so unpredictable, and because we are increasingly seeing that civilian vehicles, civilian buildings are being targeted by Russian forces. One more important thing to mention, Dana, an aid convoy has been trying to make it into the port city of Mariupol. That city has been heavily bombarded and under siege for well over a week now. President Volodymyr Zelensky really imploring Russians to allow that convoy to deliver that desperately needed humanitarian aid to that besieged city. So far, no sense of clarity as to whether it's been able to reach its destination, but the humanitarian situation there dramatically deteriorating day by day, Dana.
Well, let's hope that Vladimir Putin at least listens to that plea about humanitarian aid. And Clarissa, needless to say, we are all hoping that you and our whole crew there stays safe. We did see you in Irpin doing remarkable, remarkable work. Clarissa, thank you. And here with me now is President Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan.
And I will have the Jake Sullivan clip from Meet the Press, not from CNN State of the Union. I have a different interview from CNN State of the Union that is, which is this? Senator Rob. I have two clips of Senator Rob Portman of Ohio, Republican senator from Ohio, being interviewed by Dana Bash coming up. But you saw there Clarissa Ward talking about, and Dana Bash talking about how she'd worked in Irpin, the city where this journalist was killed, and they definitely concentrated on the death of the journalist more than any of the other people. I guess that's kind of what you might expect from journalists reporting on journalists. But otherwise, I thought that was a good report, comparable to the other ones. This next report, the Fox News Sunday report, I have some criticisms I'll give afterwards, but I almost feel like I shouldn't, because it's Bret Baier, who's, I guess, one of their most straight news journalists of all their supposedly straight news journalists on Fox News. Now that Chris Wallace is gone, Bret Baier is like one of the most journalistic people they have, although I don't think he is that unbiased from clips or Fox News bias videos I've made in the past featuring him. But they also have their reporter in Kyiv, Benjamin Hall, doing the first report. And breaking news today, that guy, Fox News reporter Benjamin Hall, not killed, but in the hospital, was injured. I don't know exactly how seriously. So you're about to see a report from a Fox News journalist who at least put himself in harm's way, because he's definitely been harmed. And so, I don't know. I still might criticize the report, but I guess you got to give him credit for literally putting his life on the line to report on this story. And I will talk about that a little more after we watch Bret Baier and the injured Benjamin Hall from Fox News Sunday yesterday reporting on I noticed the big word that everybody was using, and I put it in the description of the clips, that it's the widening invasion, the widening war in Ukraine. And I think you saw that in the previous clips. I think it might be in this one. Let's find out and talk about it after we watch together over here.
And hello again from Fox News in Washington. You're looking live at Lviv in western Ukraine, where Russian forces have escalated attacks, striking a military base near the Polish border and bringing the war closer to NATO's doorstep, where the U.S. has dispatched soldiers. and refugees have fled harm's way. Russia had warned it sees U.S. weapons shipments to Ukraine as a, quote, legitimate target. But the White House is sending another $200 million in military aid after 3 weeks of brutal attacks. In a moment, we'll speak with Deputy Secretary of State Wendy Sherman. But we begin with Fox team coverage. Mike Tobin in Lviv, where the refugee crisis shows no signs of slowing. First to Benjamin Hall on the ground in Kyiv, where leaders remain defiant. Benjamin.
Yeah, good morning, Brett. In a very significant strike this morning by Russian forces just 12 miles from the Polish border. They were striking at a large Ukrainian military facility and they left 35 people dead. That is the largest, biggest loss of life since this conflict began in a single strike. The target had been a former NATO training facility which housed US troops till just a few weeks ago. Yesterday, Russia said that arms shipments would be targeted and other aid as well that was coming into the country, and it's thought this attack was an attempt to cut off that supply of weapons. Meanwhile, there has been repeated shelling overnight in the outskirts of the capital, Kyiv. Still, though, no major push to move into the city itself. The concern now, though, is that as with other cities where ground invasions have faltered, the Russians will resort to indiscriminate shelling. President Zelensky earlier warning them against it.
If they kill all of us, then they will enter Kyiv. If this is the goal, then let them enter, but they will end up living alone on this land, certainly without us. They will not find friends among us.
Ukrainian forces have had significant success ambushing Russian convoys, largely thanks to the US Javelin anti-tank missiles that have come in. But it's also because the Russian army has performed poorly. Its equipment is old, its tactics outdated. Instead, they have been relying on overwhelming force. In some of the smaller cities and towns that Russia does control, now they are trying to put in place a civil governance of their own, kidnapping one mayor and replacing him with theirs, while also pushing to set up breakaway states in the south. But even there, they are facing resistance. Hundreds of people coming out and protesting the new occupation, a reminder that they will never tolerate Russian rule. Meanwhile, the siege of major cities like Mariupol and Kharkiv continue, with hundreds of thousands still stuck without water, food, heating, medicine. The mayor of Mariupol says over 1,500 people have died in that city alone, while other smaller towns and cities who resist have been totally destroyed. On the diplomatic front, the Foreign Minister Kuleba says that they are willing to negotiate, but they will not surrender. President Macron of France and Chancellor Scholz of Germany spoke with President Putin yesterday, seeking just a 24-hour ceasefire. They couldn't get even that. Now President Zelensky saying he hopes Israel might be able to mediate between the two countries, possibly hosting talks in Jerusalem. Brett?
Benjamin Hall reporting from Kyiv. Benjamin, thank you. Earlier, we took a look at Russia's latest maneuvers with Fox News strategic analyst General Jack Keane. General Jack Keane, thanks for being here.
So, yeah, then they had their military guy on staff, General Jack Keane, to do that analysis. That, again, like I said, they went to their reporter in Kyiv who gave a good report before being seriously injured, so I don't really want to criticize him too much. And, in fact, he did talk a little bit about what I was giving credit to the Richard Engel news summary too, for talking about how they're trying to set up some civil government. I guess Benjamin Hall didn't really do as good a job talking about how it was a sign of preparing for a longer occupation, but kidnapping mayors and setting up sort of their own governments or their own civil institution there, or whatever it is going on. It's hard to tell exactly from these news summaries, but overall, I don't think it was non-journalistic. You know, I talk every week almost about how Fox News isn't really a news organization, how it was created to be a propaganda outlet for the Republican Party. If you want to know more about that, just read this book, The Loudest Voice in the Room by Gabriel Sherman, and you can see how Roger Ailes actually created the Fox News channel for that purpose. But sometimes, incidentally, journalism does occur, and this week I don't want to be too critical because I feel bad about a Fox News reporter putting his life on the line and getting seriously injured, Benjamin Hall. So anyway, you can tell me what you think about that report compared to the other three. And then the last one is from CBS News' Face the Nation, Margaret Brennan and Charlie D'Agata. Charlie D'Agata got in trouble a couple weeks ago, not from his Face of the Nation news summary, but from another news summary talking about how, it was terrible that war had come to like a civilized nation like Ukraine, unlike like the Middle East barbaric nations or, oops, almost knocked over my microphone there. But he doesn't say anything bad this week, and it wasn't in a Face of the Nation news summary anyway. I talked about that a little last week, but just I think that shame has to follow Charlie D'Agata a little bit, even though he's also in a war zone, putting his life on the line, just like Benjamin Hall. But I will talk about his news summary a little more after you watch that final news summary juxtaposed with the other 4 corporate news outlets. And we can talk about them all together now after we watch this last one here.
Good morning and welcome to Face the Nation. There is no end in sight to Russia's rampage on Ukraine. The Ukrainian government says the civilian death toll alone is in the thousands. Ukraine's president said today that 13,000 Russians are dead in the conflict. The U.S. cannot confirm that death toll. Today, news about the death of an American journalist, Brent Renaud, killed in a Russian attack on the capital city of Kyiv. Our Charlie D'Agata has been reporting from Kyiv since the invasion nearly 3 weeks ago. Charlie?
Good morning, Margaret. The regional governor said more than 30 cruise missiles struck that base less than 20 miles from the Polish border. It's a military base that's been used by the U.S. and NATO partners for training exercises, drawing the West and U.S. allies closer to the fight.
The overnight aerial assault in Lviv is the latest attack in a Russian offensive that has widened and intensified by the hour. Russian tanks rumble down the street in the besieged port city of Mariupol. There's been no let-up in Russia's relentless bombardment. To the west, in Russian-occupied Melitopol, thousands of residents protested in the streets after video emerged appearing to show Russian troops kidnapping its mayor. And the Ukrainian government says a second mayor has been abducted from the city of Dnipro-Rudna. There's now growing evidence that the airstrike that destroyed the maternity hospital in Mariupol may be part of a systematic campaign. The World Health Organization has verified 24 attacks on medical facilities since the invasion began. After taking fire at this hospital in Kyiv, they covered the windows and work with the lights out at night.
On this building, look, not finished building, in the highest floor, work a sniper.
A sniper?
Sniper.
While we were there, doctors were saving the life of a first responder torn apart by shrapnel, even while trying to rescue the wounded. With the Russian advance now bearing down, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky rallied residents to defend the capital in an overnight address. If they kill all of us, then they will enter Kyiv, he said. If this is the goal, then let them enter, but they will not find friends among us. It is already a reality in the suburb of Bucha, where they're burying the dead in mass graves, a terrifying prelude of what may be to come. Now, the outskirts are really getting hit hard now, and as Russian forces move into more densely populated areas, the civilian death toll is rising dramatically, and residents are now risking their lives just to get away. Margaret?
Charlie D'Agata in Kyiv, thank you. We turn now to Odessa in the south of Ukraine and our Chris Livesay for a look at how the Ukrainians are coping.
And so CBS actually had another reporter in the south there in Odessa to report in addition to Charlie D'Agata in Ukraine. And I mean, I guess seeing it, that's, I think they were the only one that had a southern reporter. There was reporting from Lviv. Martha Raddatz herself was anchoring from Lviv all the way in the west near Poland. I mean, I don't know. I thought the Charlie D'Agata report was one thing I noticed watching all 5 of them together like that. You notice how they use a lot of the same clips. They report a lot of the same facts, but it's just produced in a different way. And sometimes it has like a different emotional effect. I think for some reason, I think that CBS News one, especially with all the hospital scenes there, was the most had the highest emotional reactivity, had like made you most sad about what? I mean, they all have their heartbreaking scenes there, and a lot of them talked about the maternity hospital, and I talked about all that as war propaganda, but also the real cost of war that we don't, a lot of times people think of war as like a video game, and it is hurting lots of people, millions of refugees, thousands of casualties, and that was all covered in those news summaries. And you can let me know who you think did it best, and which of the big 5 corporate outlets of ABC, NBC, CBS, CNN, and Fox News. You can keep them all separate in your mind. But I think they're all contenders this week, and they all have their good points and some of their more biased points. But you can let me know what you think in the comment section as we move on to the newsmaker clips. I'm going to show you 2 administration officials being interviewed, and then I'm going to show you 2 Republicans being interviewed, and then I'm going to go to a couple clips at the end about gas prices and inflation, which involve the Republican senator from Ohio, Rob Portman, and then this economic advisor to Allianz, which is this big transport company, Mohammed El Arian, on CBS News' Face the Nation. But let me start. It's going to be Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby on ABC, and then White House National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan on NBC, talking about different ways that this Russian invasion of Ukraine could escalate. That's kind of like the World War III aspect that I put in the title. Starting with John Kirby on ABC asked about no-fly zone and the possibility of the war widening to Poland, and then chemical and biological weapon use as a possibility and a possible escalation that could lead to a wider war. All the things that I guess we should be worrying about at this point, and that I will talk about with you a little more after we watch Martha Raddatz interview Pentagon Press Secretary John Kirby over in this clip.
And Ukraine's defense minister called this a terror attack near the NATO border, saying action must be taken to stop this, close the sky. Could a no-fly zone could have stopped this?
No, I don't think so, Martha. Look, I mean, no-fly zone has a nice air policing kind of sound to it, but I participated in one as a young officer on an aircraft carrier way back in the early 90s. It is combat. You have to be willing to shoot and to be shot at. President Biden has made it clear that U.S. troops are not going to be fighting in Ukraine, and there's a good reason for that, because the United States getting involved in combat in Ukraine right now or over the skies of Ukraine right now leads to war with Russia. And there's very little that you can see that would make sense for this war to be escalated between 2 nuclear powers.
If those attacks on military supply centers cross into Poland, and I know that is a fear of the United States and the NATO allies, what changes? Kamala Harris just reaffirmed the pledge, the Article 5 pledge to defend NATO members. If they strike in Poland, what happens?
Well, look, we take our Article 5 commitment very seriously, and the Vice President was pretty firm about that on a recent visit. So has been Secretary Austin. An armed attack against one is considered an armed attack against all. That is why, Martha, we continue to flow and to move and to reposition forces and capabilities along NATO's eastern flank to make sure that we can defend every inch of NATO territory if we need to. Now, there's no reason we should need to, because there's no reason that there should be war in Ukraine as it is. And we've made it very clear to Russia that NATO territory will be defended not just by the United States, but by our allies. We have a deconfliction mechanism set up so that we can talk to the Russian Ministry of Defense. That system is working, that line is working, and we will absolutely not hesitate to use it if we need to.
But this was just 10 miles from that border. I just crossed that border the other day. Doesn't this change the way you look at things? They're getting closer and closer to our NATO allies?
I can tell you that we have been consistently concerned about NATO's eastern flank and that airspace and, of course, that ground space on that flank of NATO. And we continue to look for ways to bolster the defenses of our NATO allies. We continue to look for ways to try to protect that airspace. Just a few days ago, as you know, Martha, we repositioned 2 Patriot batteries from Germany into Poland, not far from where you are right now, to make sure that we can absolutely defend that airspace.
And give us the big picture here, John. I know we've heard a lot about possible chemical, biological attacks and that the Russians were staging this false flag, trying to say Ukraine is going to do an attack. What can you tell us more about that, and how likely is that? How concerned are you this morning?
Well, I want to be careful we don't get into intelligence assessments here. We continue to watch this very, very closely. It is of the Russian playbook that which they accuse you of, they're planning to do. Now, again, we haven't seen anything that indicates some sort of imminent chemical or biological attack right now, but we're watching this very, very closely.
And you've said the Russians miscalculated.
And yeah, there Martha Raddatz moves on to mistakes Russia made, but that was the part of the interview where I think she covered a lot of the ways that this Russian invasion of Ukraine could escalate to involve, World War III or a wider war. I mean, one thing I think is a little over alarmist is the way, and I saw this in some of the news summaries about talking about how Russia's getting closer and closer to our NATO allies. Well, I mean, Russia is like, I'm looking at a map and it looks like Russia is already on the border with 2 NATO members, Estonia and Latvia. And if you include like Belarus as part of Russia, which it kind of is at this point, then that even includes Lithuania. So it's not like Russia's not already on the border with NATO as it is. Anyway, I thought that was just a little bit over alarmist, but otherwise it was a good discussion of the various ways that, I mean, is this World War III? Is this the beginning of World War III? I mean, this is kind of how World War III could start, I guess. Although right now there's not really much of anyone on Russia's side except for a few like rogue states. And then one of the questions is about whether China is going to be supportive of Russia. And that actually comes up in this next news interview. This is NBC News Meet the Press, Chuck Todd talking to Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor for the Biden White House, discussing a lot of the same things you just saw John Kirby talking about, ways that this could escalate. But I kept the clip going through the China part because I guess if you're going to have World War III, that Russia's got to have some allies. And one of the additional facts that has come up today is Jake Sullivan met with a representative of the Chinese government. I think it might have been in Rome, but he conveyed a lot of Biden administration warnings to China not to be too supportive of this Russian invasion. And I mean, it looks like China's not, it's not going to be World War III without Russia and China together, I guess. I mean, because Russia doesn't have any real major supporters. I mean, that's not a lot of comfort if the nuclear missiles start flying that Russia's all by itself. It's not really a world war. It's just a nuclear war against Russia. But I don't know. I guess that kind of still qualifies as World War III if we blow up the whole world. But anyway, on that dark note, let's look at the other Biden administration official here talking about possible ways this war could escalate and how the Biden administration is trying to keep China from being on the side of Russia over in this clip.
Major development of the week was this warning from Western intelligence that Russia was preparing perhaps to use chemical or biological weapons. The president used the phrase severe price in reaction to what would happen if Russia did this. He said they'd pay a severe price. I assume these economic sanctions are a severe price. Can you define what that phrase means?
I'm not going to, in public, lay out the specifics of the severe consequences that Russia would face were it to actually use chemical or biological weapons inside Ukraine. I will just say that the United States, in coordination with our allies and partners, is prepared to impose such severe consequences, and we have communicated that directly to the Russians. We have consulted with our allies and partners about it, and we are prepared for that eventuality. And part of the reason, Chuck, that we're so concerned that this may happen is that when Russia starts accusing other countries of potentially doing something, it's a good tell that they may be on the cusp of doing it themselves. What we're here to do is to deny them the capacity to have a false flag operation, to blame this on the Ukrainians or on us, to take away their pretext, and to make the world understand that if chemical weapons are used in Ukraine, it is the Russians who will have used them, and the response will, as the president said, be severe.
So you want strategic ambiguity here, meaning you want Putin to think the consequence could be anything?
We want to be able to communicate directly to Russia alongside our allies what those consequences could be, but I do not want to sit in public and lay out every possible option available to the president, available to our allies to respond. We would prefer to do this directly through channels, and we think that puts us in the best position to deter it and the best position to respond should they actually move forward with a chemical attack.
Is there a severe economic consequence that we've not leveled against him yet?
Well, you just saw on Friday the president, alongside of his fellow G7 leaders, announce a further round of economic sanctions to include cutting Russia off from large elements of the international trading system, denying the import of key Russian products to the United States, imposing a ban on luxury goods going to those oligarchs and cronies around Putin. That was the next step in an ongoing effort to continue to squeeze the Russian economy, and it's having enormous impact. And there are additional steps that we will continue to take, additional targets of oligarchs that we were developing, additional measures to tighten the vice, the economic vice that we have put around the Russian economy. We'll continue to do that with our allies and partners, and we will see the results. As we've seen, the Russian stock market hasn't opened in 2 weeks, and they've just announced it won't open, because if it were to open, you would see an immediate cratering of the stock market, showing just how much damage to the Russian economy has already occurred.
Does China or any Chinese businesses or the Chinese government, are they going to be targeted with sanctions if they're seen as helping Russia get around ours?
We have made it clear to not just Beijing, but every country in the world that if they think that they can basically bail Russia out, they can give Russia a workaround to the sanctions that we've imposed, they should have another thing coming, because we will ensure that neither China nor anyone else can compensate Russia for these losses. In terms of the specific means of doing that, again, I'm not going to lay all of that out in public, but we will communicate that privately to China, as we have already done, and will continue to do.
I got one more question for you about the issue of Venezuelan oil.
If you want to see the Venezuelan oil, you have to watch the whole Meet the Press at the link down under sources that I put in the video description. But I thought Chuck Todd did a fairly good job eliciting kind of the same information, or some of the same information you heard from John Kirby over on ABC's This Week with George Stephanopoulos, or Martha Raddatz, actually, in this case, talking about various ways that this current conflict could escalate to a wider war. You heard that Jake Sullivan wouldn't say on live TV or to the news media what it is that would be the consequences of Russia using chemical or biological weapons, but he did say that they had communicated to Russia what those consequences would be. I was reading the live comments along the way. First, I did want to thank Lulu Girl and Matthew for the Super Chat contributions that I saw they gave earlier on. That it helps me, especially, I think, with World War III in the title this week, I'm not going to get any ad revenue. I think YouTube is going to decide this is too controversial to monetize, so if you want me to put things like World War III in the title when I think they deserve to be in the title, you can support my YouTube videos either through Super Chat or there's a link down right under the video to my Patreon page where you can become a monthly patron or through direct contributions through PayPal. But I also in the live comments I saw a question, I think it was from, Seal Beater. Why would Russia use bio or chemical weapons? Well, there actually is a reason. Russia is having problems with the invasion of Ukraine right now and taking over the cities. And basically, they had this plan that was supposed to take over Kyiv within 3 days. And they didn't really plan for this kind of long war where there's heavy resistance from the native Ukrainians. And so one of the things they can do is they can like blow up the cities. You heard the president, Vladimir Zelensky, say that they could level the cities and kill everyone. But if they use chemical weapons, all the people like hiding in the basements and stuff, if they put chemical weapons in there, they can kill the people, but not have to destroy all the infrastructure and the buildings. And then when the chemical or biological weapons or whatever dissipate, they can go in and take that territory with all the infrastructure intact, I guess. I mean, that would be one reason that it's so horrific. And one of the things chemical and biological weapons often boomerang on the people who are using them. They're not very surgical strike weapons, and but as to what someone who has no no morals and ethics or care about war crimes or whatever, why they might want to use that's one explanation I would give. But anyway, those are the two administration officials talking about the Biden policy on various ways that this war could escalate into a wider war. Now I'm going to show you a couple Republicans talking about it, and if you're paying attention to Fox News and the Republicans, the main thing they're saying is that Biden is being too weak. He's ruling out World War III, that lets Biden get over on him, because if you rule anything out, then I actually think it's a good thing to make clear that or be as strong as possible in avoiding escalation, which is what I see the Biden administration doing. But anyway, here is Senator Jim Risch, Republican from Idaho, answering a question, almost the exact title of my video. This is Bret Baier asking him, so how do we stop Putin without starting World War III? So I actually like this question, but the answer is kind of ridiculous, as I will talk about with you a little more after we watch that answer from the Idaho Republican over in this clip.
Let's turn to Ukraine. How do you stop Vladimir Putin without starting World War III?
Well, there's no doubt that you always have to keep in mind that you don't want to escalate to a direct confrontation with Russia. I wouldn't call it World War III. I think if the thing did get away there, I think it'd end pretty quickly, because with the conventional forces that he's had there, we haven't seen this kind of ineptness in a long, long time. So I'm not as concerned about that. I think you always have to be wary of that. But look, the administration has projected weakness throughout this. It's been too little, too late from the beginning. You remember everything that we've tried to do, they said no, and then eventually they say yes. And that started with the sanctions. It started with giving them Stinger missiles. They said no. Then when our allies stepped up and gave Stingers, then they said okay. The same thing with the Javelin anti-tank weapons. They said no. Then when our allies stepped up, they said yes. They're just dragging their feet. Look, when you're dealing with these people, if you project weakness, you're going to have a real problem. That's going on with both Iran and with Russia right now. And it is a serious situation. We need them to project some strength.
Senator, there are some in your party who think that some of these sanctions are having a reverberation on Americans in the middle of the country, and that we need to have kind of a cost basis analysis for what we're doing.
So yeah, that's another Fox News talking point about how this is like hurting Americans more than it's hurting Putin and the Russians. And but you did hear that Bret Baier had no follow up on Biden being too weak when he started so well with the question about avoiding World War III, but by the time he listened to the end of that Idaho Republican senator's answer, he apparently didn't really care about World War III and not starting World War III. Or anyway, that's the Fox News journalistic interview with a Republican senator, I guess, that still didn't really have much cross-examination that I would call journalistic. And here's Dana Bash on CNN's State of the Union with another Republican senator, Rob Portman, with some of the same issues. So I thought I would compare the two, and I will talk about that a little more after we watch that clip together over here.
Well, I know that you have been urging the U.S. to help Ukraine get fighter jets through and from Poland, and they were going to do it through a U.S. airbase. But you just heard Jake Sullivan mention that the intelligence community assessment is that that move would risk an escalation. Are you worried that giving those planes to Ukraine could actually trigger World War III?
I don't know why that would be true. The Russians have complained about everything. Vladimir Putin has said that the sanctions are an act of war. They certainly complained when we provided stingers directly from the U.S. government, which can knock down an airplane and have been successful in doing that at lower altitudes. We have given them helicopters. As recently as January, we provided them U.S. military helicopters, and those are directly from the United States. In this case, this would be Poland providing these airplanes, which are Soviet-style planes, old planes, MiG-29s. There are also two other countries, Slovakia and Bulgaria, that have these airplanes. Mm-hmm. What we've heard directly from the Ukrainians is they want them badly. They want the ability to have better control over the skies in order to give them a fighting chance. So I don't understand why we're not doing it. We initially gave it a green light, as you know, last weekend. The Secretary of State said it was going to get a green light, and for some reason now we're blocking it. So I don't understand why this is any worse than, from a Russian point of view, than other things
isn't the issue
we've
that
already done or that we're talking about.
Isn't the issue that they would go through an American air base, Ramstein, and that is what is seen as an escalation? I mean, I've certainly heard that from military sources. I'm sure you have.
Well, again, we've sent lots of weaponry through military bases. In fact, we were just with the 82nd Airborne last night, who are here in Poland, thank God, and they're doing a terrific job. But this is what we've been doing all along. So I don't see that change. I do think that what Jake Sullivan said today is encouraging in the sense that he talked about at least providing providing Ukraine with the anti-aircraft systems they need to be able to better protect themselves. We've already provided those for Poland, the Patriot system. But the systems he's talking about are probably also these Soviet-era systems like the S-300, which is not the top of the line, but is very effective still. Mm-hmm. And again, Poland and other former Warsaw Bloc countries have these. So at a minimum, let's get those into Ukraine, and let's stop talking about it, and let's do it. But the airplanes are also essential. And to me, Vladimir Putin and the Russians seem to be saying everything is escalatory, and yet they are escalating every single day by coming into Ukraine with these weapons. There's discussion, as you know, of them using vacuum bombs and cluster bombs against civilian targets. This is an illegal, this is a brutal, totally unprovoked attack, and increasingly they're choosing civilian targets. So as they escalate, what the Ukrainian people are asking for is just the ability to defend themselves. Give them the ability to try to stop some of this Russian superiority in terms of air power, to be able to save lives and hopefully end up with a peaceful solution to this. If we don't figure out a way to help Ukraine push back, that's much less likely.
So yeah, there's another Republican trying to be like stronger than the Biden administration when it comes to standing up to Russia and Putin. This particularly in terms of these fighter jets, these old Russian MiGs that Poland wanted to transfer to Ukraine, but they were afraid to do it themselves directly, and so they talked about I don't know how this whole controversy actually started, but I think it was all about public relations with spokespeople for Poland reacting to calls by Vladimir Zelensky, and anyway, Poland didn't want to directly transfer the MiGs to Ukraine, so they said, we'll send them to Germany, and then the United States can send them over. And anyway, apparently the Biden administration has decided that it's too dangerous in terms of the possibility of escalation, of Russia seeing it as an excuse or a trigger or a provocation or whatever you want to call it to start a wider war. And I don't know, that's kind of the Republican talking point that I've seen over and over again on Fox News. And I think when I show the Dash clip, I saw someone asking, will I have a clip of Dash, my cat? Yes, I will have one, and it's at the end of, in the background, I think you're going to hear a Fox News discussion from earlier this morning about how weak Biden has been. It started with the withdrawal in Afghanistan, and that they are convinced that's why Putin went into Ukraine, and then they, he's the editorial board of the Wall Street Journal, which is owned by the same people who own Fox News, is quoted on Fox News today saying that if you say that you're ruling out World War III, well, that just gives power to Putin, when really you should be preparing for World War III, and then maybe it won't happen, or whatever the peace through strength thing is. But anyway, that is the last part I wanted to do on the Republican talking points that you're going to be hearing more and more about how Biden wasn't strong enough, first with Afghanistan and then in standing up to Putin, or, none of this ever would have happened, which I don't really think is true. And that is sort of my transition to the next couple clips about the other talking point we're going to be hearing from Republicans a lot going into the November midterms, that inflation and especially gas prices are all Biden's fault. I don't know how many times I've heard about the Keystone XL pipeline on Fox News since gas prices started going up. And the Keystone XL pipeline wouldn't have done anything. I mean, it wouldn't even be done. And, Dana Bash did an okay job cross-examining Rob Portman in that last clip, but she does a great job in skewering, totally tearing apart that stupid Republican talking point about gas prices. I mean, inflation and gas prices are really not really Biden's fault. They're more having to do with the results of the worldwide pandemic. Remember that? It's actually not even over. There may even be another spike that I'll talk about in the last Newsmaker clip. They talk about briefly the upcoming new COVID surge, and especially how it's affecting China right now. But having said all that, I also have to say that whoever is president, even though they don't really control things like inflation and gas prices, they get the credit, they get the blame, and Democrats are going to, it's going to affect the midterm elections. That's kind of how I started this out. Even no matter how many facts prove that it's not Biden's fault and it's not the Democrats' fault, if there are high gas prices and high inflation, it's going to hurt them politically, because that's just the way politics works. And anyway, here's Dana Bash still doing a good job dismantling the Republican talking point for all the good it's going to do, with Ohio Republican Senator Rob Portman over in this clip.
Senator, I want to ask about the impact here at home, specifically economically, on gas prices. They've climbed to an average of $4.32 per gallon. You're calling on the U.S. to ramp up oil production after the U.S. banned importing oil from Russia this week. But I want you to listen to what President Biden said about that this week.
It's simply not true that my administration or policies are holding back domestic energy production. That's simply not true. They have 9,000 permits to drill now. They could be drilling right now, yesterday, last week, last year.
Is the president right?
No. I mean, with all due respect, let's be specific. When the president was elected, he said we're going to cut off Keystone, which is North American energy, which is what we're talking about. That was over 800,000 barrels per day, more than the Russian oil, which was 600,000 barrels a day. Second, the president issued an executive order stopping exploration on public lands and on water, public waters. And then finally, as you know, he's rewriting this legislation that is now in regulation that has to do with permitting, called Waters of the United States. And all of this is leading to less North American energy production. So
Senator,
there's some specific policy decisions that have been made.
Senator, on a couple things. On Keystone, I've not seen any report that it would have even been done in time to affect the crisis that's happening now. It wouldn't have even have been done until at least next year. And on the public lands that you're talking about, that might be true that he stopped production on public lands, but the administration they've given more permits for drilling on private lands. In fact, I have a quote from Secretary Granholm telling oil companies back in December, take advantage of the leases that you have, hire workers, get your rig up. So isn't it true that this is really just because of the pandemic and all of the economic woes and the implications from the pandemic that we're seeing now? And then, of course, exacerbated by Russia.
Can I make a comment?
Yeah.
Can I make a comment?
Please.
Okay, well, first of all, oil prices started to go up long before there was any invasion of Ukraine, as you know. So oil prices went up for a lot of reasons, but one is the fact that this administration made it a priority of theirs to stifle domestic production of fossil fuels. There's no secret to that. The campaign talked about it, and the president did it when he got elected. He had the right to do it. I disagree with him. So that's a fact, and that affected the price of oil again long before the Ukrainian issue became a factor. Second, you talk about these leases. If oil companies could know that they could make billions of dollars in investments, which is what some of these are, like the Keystone XL pipeline, and have that end up with oil and gas being able to be available in the market, they would certainly do that. And Keystone XL pipeline, yes, it was going to come on shortly, but more importantly, people who had invested billions of dollars, including the Canadians, who are very upset about this, found out what can happen in an administration that wants to stifle production. So there's a lot of lack of certainty and a real concern about making those investments now. And my own state of Ohio, as you know, is now a natural gas producer. Also, we have some oil and some wet gas. So we hear this from these companies, and all I'm saying is what we should be doing is continuing to produce as much oil and gas as we can right now, because it's a national security as well as an economic security issue. At the same time, continue our work on renewables, continue to try to make that transition, but we're not ready for that transition. And so in the meantime, we have got to be able to be energy independent again. And this is, again, as we see, a national security issue, as we're unfortunately seeing very clearly now in this crisis.
Senator, thank you so much for joining me from Poland, right near the border with Ukraine. I really appreciate it, and stay safe.
So yeah, I thought Dana Bash did a pretty good job of cross-examining Senator Rob Portman. I like the part where he's like, can I make a comment? Can I make a comment? Like, you're being interviewed, dude. Why are you asking if you can make a comment? But I don't know. Maybe he was trying to make it sound like she was being an angry woman. I don't know. Was that misogyny? I think that's right. I think we should criticize Rob Portman for his misogynistic framing of Dana Bash as an angry woman for saying, can I make a comment? Can I make a comment? But she didn't really react to that. He said, yes, please. Or she said, yes, please. But whatever. I thought that was a good cross-examination of the Republican talking point on gas prices. But what's even more interesting, I think, is what was over on CBS News' Face the Nation. They had this guy, Mohammed El-Arian, who is the financial advisor for this transport company, Allianz. And he basically pointed out that inflation isn't really the fault of the presidential administration. It's more the fault of the Federal Reserve not doing the right things at the right time. And he talks about that. And then at the end of this clip, they actually talk about another shock coming to the supply chain from the new COVID surge in China, which I will talk about with you a little more. Oh, and thank you, Lulu Girl, for the additional Super Chat contribution. I'll look into the cat collar camera situation. Dash seems to be doing fine, even though I was told back in November he was like in the end of life times, but he's just getting like fatter and friskier, but he is 17 years old. I don't know. I don't even want to think about that right now, but I will think about the cause of inflation as we watch this final Newsmaker clip before I give you a special Dash clip, which I think is kind of artistic. I kind of like the Dash clip I made for you all today. But anyway, let's watch the last Newsmaker clip. Mohammed El Arian over on CBS News' Face the Nation, talking about what really causes inflation over here.
Mohammed, you've been a critic for some time. The White House this week is calling inflation a Putin price hike. But you were on this program back in December talking about how serious inflation was. Where does the responsibility for this lie exactly?
So it lies in the circumstances. It lies in the Fed being late and mischaracterizing inflation. Till the end of November, they were calling it transitory. But also, to be fair to the administration, there will be a Putin inflation component. I estimate that at 7.9%, we will probably get very close or above 10% before we come down. And that difference will be all because of the disruption that Putin's war imply for commodity prices, supply chains, and shipments.
Double-digit inflation. When do you think we will see that? I mean, people are really feeling it now.
Yeah, if it happens, it will happen in the summer, and people will feel it. The worst thing for us would be not only do we feel the higher inflation, but we also feel income losses. That's why it's critical to avoid a recession. We can't avoid stagflation, lower growth, higher prices, but we certainly can avoid a recession, and we can bounce back quickly.
As we said, I mean, it is the Fed's job to control inflation. The White House is saying both that it is not their fault, but that they're doing something about it at the same time. Are there political measures here that actually can be taken?
There are, and they're stuck in Congress. You can do more to increase labor force participation so that wage pressure comes down. That's about childcare. That's about easing people's way back into the labor force. You can do more to enhance productivity, and you can do more to remove supply bottlenecks. The administration has policies. Lots of them are stuck in Congress right now.
When you talk about supply chain bottlenecks, we have to remember we are coming out of this global pandemic, and just overnight we're seeing headlines that local authorities in Shenzhen, China have imposed a new lockdown there due to a COVID outbreak. This is a major manufacturing hub for the rest of the world. I don't want to overstate this, but how concerned should we be about this as a factor?
We should, because China is sticking to its zero COVID policy at a time when Omicron makes that policy very hard to implement. So they will have sequential lockdowns that will have spillovers to us. We can be a good house, but we're living right now in a really tough neighborhood. And that's why it's really important to respond quickly. We can't fall behind again on policies.
Again on policies. Okay. So that's up to the Fed. But when we look ahead for the year, the Treasury Secretary is already saying we should expect 12 months of inflation. When can we play catch up there and bring prices back down? Or are these tools really out of the hands of policymakers at this point?
So Secretary Yellen is correct. We unfortunately are going to have at least 12 months of uncomfortable inflation, something that we haven't had since the 70s and 80s. And that's going to be especially problematic for the more vulnerable segments of our society. It hits food and gas particularly hard. As to what we can do, we have to be really careful that we don't get another wave of inflation due to what economists call de-anchored inflation expectations. Basically, Margaret, it's a simple story. Right now, I will go in, I being the American worker, and ask for compensation for past inflation. if I don't have faith in my policymakers, I will also ask for compensation for future inflation. I want to protect myself preemptively. If that happens, then we have that awful wage price cycle.
Mohammed Al-Arian, thank you very much for your...
So I think that was a really informative discussion there. He did talk about how there might be double-digit inflation in the summer, and that actually does not bode well for the midterms. One thing he mentioned was how a lot of the problems that are leading to some of the inflation, the childcare problems, other problems with people being available to take jobs in the current job market, especially with the COVID pandemic, a lot of those problems could be solved by legislation bottled up in Congress. So I guess that's one thing that could help Democrats if they can characterize the Republican obstructionism as also contributing to the inflation. But, I mean, the Democrats control both the House, the Senate, and the presidency, not the courts, I guess, but they're not going to control the courts for quite a while, but at least not the Supreme Court. That's a whole other issue maybe we'll be talking about in coming weeks. But anyway, I thought Mohammed Al-Arian there explained how it's really the Fed and other issues, and maybe this coming COVID surge with the zero tolerance policy of COVID in China. They just have all these shutdowns, and they don't have a good working vaccine, and they're being hit by the Omicron wave. And I haven't even talked about the stealth Omicron wave, what's it called, BA2, that is surging in a lot of European countries that could cause this whole other wave in the United States if we're just several weeks behind Europe, as we often are. And I guess that's all stuff to cover in the future. But anyway, I wanted to thank all of you for joining me. That's the last of the Newsmaker clips. I wanted to show those last two as sort of foreshadowing of the increasing Republican talking points we're going to hear about gas prices and inflation as we get closer to the midterms, as well as what you heard from Senator Jim Risch of Idaho and even Senator Rob Portman of Ohio about Biden being too weak and bringing on the Putin invasion of Russia, and not escalating enough and getting us close enough to World War III to stop World War III, because that's the only way to stop World War III is to threaten World War III, or I guess that's going to be the Republican talking point. But anyway, that's it for the show today, and I did promise this Dash clip that I took earlier today. I think in the background you hear Fox News is outnumbered, and some woman carrying forward one of these talking points about Biden weakness engendering this whole thing. But meanwhile, you'll see Dash at his water bowl over there drinking the water, and as I was taking the clip, I got more and more focused on the Dash, the cat in the water bowl, which is why I thought this was a little bit artistic. And I'll end the show, I guess, after we watch that clip together over here.
We have an ongoing conversation about how the measures of presidency sometimes reveal in moments that are unforeseen, in the issues and traumas that are unforeseen. But what we are seeing here in this administration is a failure on both fronts, both with the unforeseen geopolitical threats, the things that have arisen because of keeping the Putin lunacy in the right, and we have also seen the utter failures from policies that they implemented day one, the ones that get the voters.
So anyway, that's my Dash clip to end the show. I wish I had a Dash and Sandy or Dandy clip, but we all know why that isn't going to happen. And anyway, this is now every other week I have this meeting where I work on the local Sacramento County District Attorney race with a whole bunch of other community activists. It starts in 2 minutes, so I'll be back next Monday, and maybe I can go later next Monday because there's no meeting next Monday. And then every Monday, at least through the November midterms. Thanks to everyone who showed up to support the show with the live comments. Thank you to my recorded show viewers. Let me know what you think about the clips I picked out, the time I put in, my media criticism and political commentary. And I guess until next Monday, or until I have some other reason to upload a video, I will be seeing all of you around the internet.